I think this yellow is going to be a little too heavy, but I want to lay on some yellow. So, at this point in the background, I want to make identifiable shapes, and so I'm doing that with heavier pigment. This is M. Graham's Azo Yellow. It's basically the same thing as Winsor Yellow, and I'm using it to see if there's any differences. It was on sale at a local retailer for 40% off. So that's some pretty hot potatoes. So yeah, I guess the first thing I was going to talk about... Yeah, make this whole thing pretty green. The first thing I was going to talk about was, well gosh, it's all pretty interconnected. I guess it's... I guess the issue of free speech and assembly, or maybe the controlling of speech and the control of language and how that affects how effective democratic institutions can be. And there seems to be a fair amount of that going on right now. But also, influence machines are sort of working to just make money and continue having pretty sensational stories. So it's causing people's opinions to get more extreme and be based off of really shallow sound bite sort of arguments. And yeah, I've been reading a lot of George Orwell, and I guess over the last couple of years, but recently as well. And he just talks about very similar stuff in ostensibly pretty different circumstances. He was writing in the... Well, most of his essays and articles and political writing, which he said he had been reduced, or he was a sort of pamphleteer. Most of that was mid to late 30s into the 40s until he died. And so he was talking about how the left in Britain had pretty much just taken on a pro-Moscow stance, and he talked in almost all of his books about the left being co-opted by authoritarian ideas and regimes. And so there was this idea that the Soviet Union represented the far left, but it really didn't. It represented right-wing socialism, or state capitalism, and so basically you still have income inequality and you still have capitalism, but the state just runs it all. And so yeah, and I mentioned earlier in another video, and there's a fallacy called the no true Scotsman fallacy, and it might seem like I kind of made that. People say, I guess the reductio ad whatever for this is, oh, no one's ever tried socialism. And then everyone like laughs at that, and that's a joke that people make to each other on the internet. And what they sometimes mean is that, or what they mean if they're being more articulate, but they probably don't even know, is that left-wing socialism was co-opted early and often in Europe and then in America, and it was used as a political tool of Russia. And like a lot of this stuff it's just fact. I mean, it's you can say it's propaganda, but it is well, that was distracting. You can say it's propaganda, but so many people would have to be in on a massive collusion over a huge period of time on all sides for the Soviet Union and for Stalin to have actually been a real great guy, and for the Red Scare to be totally unfounded. And most of these people aren't acting on pure ideology. So in the United States, the labor movement suffers because essentially the big the big unions sell out the smaller unions that are more left-wing, and they get in bed with business for preferential treatment and really good jobs for the people in their unions. Jack London wrote about that in The Iron Heel, so it had probably been happening for some time. That book, I think, is 1917. So why I think Orwell is really important right now is because he talks about language and the public discussion, and he talks about the control of language, and oh gosh, there's more yellow. And he talks about this sort of cannibalism amongst the left wing that is funded by Russia. And so I guess that's the thing, is I think you have to have a pretty skewed view of the world if you think that reading Orwell is going to harm you, or it's going to be bad. All of it's pretty short. He was a clear writer. His novels are good, and his essays are excellent. So I would really recommend reading Orwell and evaluating his claims and seeing if they sync, if they sync with reality to your understanding, or they seem plausible, and trying to see if that's applicable to the current situation. And why I think that matters is Orwell was very much for freedom of speech, and I mean, pretty obviously by his work, because the state controlled speech to control the people in Oceania in 1984, and he talks about an homage to Catalonia, how the government was manufacturing blatant propaganda. I mean, they had a minister of propaganda who just published things that were blatant lies. And so, yeah, free speech is sort of the self-correcting freedom that you need to have other freedoms. You can't really have a right to bear arms if you have no freedom of speech. Because, I mean, in the extreme, your speech could be controlled to the fact that you could technically ask, maybe, for arms to bear, but that would cause you to be targeted or whatever. Like, you have to protect unpopular speech because a lot of influential speech is unpopular, and so you can't just stifle unpopular opinion, because the country was sort of founded on the idea that the tyranny of the majority won't dominate the politics, and that's why the Senate was set up, and that's why we have a Supreme Court, and we don't just have a straight Congress or just basically one parliament that makes all the rules. They saw a parliament and they designed it understanding what Parliament was and the limitations of it. Yeah. So I think I'm going to dry this off and make some phone calls. And I'm probably going to lay on more yellow. Oh. Well. Okay. So, yeah, basically what I'm trying to get at is George Orwell, pretty good person to read if you're concerned about politics and you're concerned about authoritarianism and you're concerned about free speech or the control of language, or you're concerned about living in a police state, or you're concerned about imperialism, or you're concerned about ethics. So, if you're not concerned about any of those things, that's creepy. You're a creepy person. But, you know, creepers gotta creep, I guess. So, I've got some magenta. I wanted to talk about paint brands for a second. Oh gosh, that's pretty heavy. I'm gonna just use these strips of paper from other stuff, from other horrific hacky projects. Yeah. it's good to see how much is going to come off your brush before you apply it to the paper. I don't always do it because I'm a chump and an amateur. So, different paint brands. This magenta, all of these paints, all of these paints are Winsor Newton. I also have some Daniel Smith paints. They work really well. I don't see a ton of difference between the two brands. And I don't really have a lot of complaints. I bought them through online retailers, and they're reasonably affordable for how long they last. I wouldn't suggest student paints. They're a scam con, because they're filled with binders, so you have to use more paint to get the same amount of color, and it gets washed out because binders affect the transparency of the paint, and it's just not worth it unless you absolutely have to. I wouldn't use student paints, and I don't know what that would necessitate. That you absolutely had to, but you still had the time and like space to do watercolor. So yeah, if you have kids and you want them to do watercolor, buy them real paint and tell them not to eat it, and that's way better than the student paint, which is still not great to eat and is much worse paint. Also, if you're trying to get your kids into art and you're worried about their health, art products are all made of poison, and don't kid yourself. Yeah. I don't generally find the ones that aren't made of poison to be that worthwhile, because I like the heavy, pure pigments. So, yeah, that's gonna come. I'm gonna try to pick some of that up, because that's really magenta. If I did this with a smaller brush, I would have more control, but I've been trying to use this larger brush for most of this, because it is pretty good. So, the Orwell discussion in general is sort of applying to the specifics of the Charlottesville stuff. I've had a lot of discussions. I had a long conversation. This is just for the NSA, if they need help identifying me. I had a long conversation with a friend who's in another state. It was like 2 hours long, so that should sync up with the metadata. Delusions of grandeur. I had a long conversation with a friend about Charlottesville, and it's like a special kind of terrible, because there's pretty clear conclusions to be drawn from it, and it seems like no one in public is really drawing those conclusions, and really, it's always uncomfortable when you have to defend people with just extremely reprehensible views that, like, you're ideologically opposed to, but it's just, I don't know, I think it's this continued problem of the public influence sphere, a lot of it being comedians and just people whose jobs are not to take a nuanced view of politics. They're to make money on superficial discussions of politics. And the Stephen Colbert talked about how the rally to unite the right was a clear provocation for violence, and that just like it was sort of a settled issue, and just as a punchline of a joke. And in an earlier time where people maybe had more of a understanding that there was television, there was everything else, there was real life, it might be less troubling, but it's a really limited view. It's just saying that those people are there to provoke violence, and then, I mean, you're not backing it up with anything, and the people in, for lack of a better word, Antifa, are showing up with weapons. I mean, they're showing up to do violence, and they say online publicly that it is okay to do violence against these groups. And the cops pretty much just stood down and let it happen, which in the past, when far-right nationalist groups protest, they get police protection because that's part of the protection of freedom of speech. I mean, the Westboro Baptist Church gets police protection, and that's another topic, but this stuff is not being handled well at all by like anyone in the traditional spheres of influence. And I think it really is just because, I think that to the debate right now, it seems like it's all, internet, it's all vaguely on the internet, but a lot of these websites are being founded by Silicon Valley people that have established political views or incentives to have politics go a particular way. There's a lot of these websites that hire writers based on their demographic group and not as much based on writing samples. And there's venture capitalists are opening up these opinion sites because it's big money, and you can at the very least have people have your hook up with advertisers and tailor your content to be more friendly to those advertisers. I mean, one thing is I've had discussions with people who, Democrats or liberals, who tell me that it's cool to use Russia Today as a news source because, like, for opinion, I think Tom Hartman's on RT now, and it's owned by the Russian government because of the corrupt authoritarian oligarchy and all, and it's just, it seems really cynical. I don't know, man. It is their policy to break up democracy and to break up the EU, and in the past that was because they wanted to take territory, and they just annexed a part of a country. I mean, this isn't a fantasy, and it isn't paranoia. China and Russia, it is in their interests to undermine Western democracy and democracy in general, and they are both doing it. So, yeah, maybe Pravda is not the best source of news that takes both sides into account. Also thinking I don't know, unless it's your full-time job, just thinking that you're not going to casually absorb some of these viewpoints and some of you're not going to evaluate and check every single thing that someone who has a seemingly sympathetic view to you is going to say. And that's the thing, is like with Tom Hartman or whatever, I mean, these people, this is their job. Their job is to have political opinions and say them. It's not out of he was a radio man. It's just people used to work on the radio, and that's translated into this now. And so yeah, yes y'all. Yes y'all. I'm liking this magenta. I think that will dry and look pretty good. I added magenta to the stem, and that's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to have to darken that up a bit later. Cool. I think I'm going to lay some more magenta over here, and here, to try to darken that area. Cool beans. So, that's the thing, is the people, what unite the right seems to me is an effort to more mainstream white nationalism towards like more mainstream conservatives, and trying to sort of fuzzy up the lines of where white nationalism starts and ends. And I think that this really is just the spread of white identity politics. in response to the sort of everyone but white identity politics, and Asians. I don't see a lot of, as an Asian comma, I just don't, it doesn't seem to be the same thing that's been commented on by other people elsewhere. Brett Weinstein was talking about how at Evergreen there was a symposium that talked about Asian people as part of the problem. And you can evaluate how credible he is as a source, and maybe I'm a fool for believing what he says, but he seems like a pretty credible guy, and he's had a pretty consistent message. And I would have done the same, pretty similar things I would hope I would have had the courage to do with a family. Because if I had a family, I think I would just be a horrific coward, because I would just do whatever to like, that would basically just be my first responsibility, and I would tunnel vision on that, and then I would do what a lot of people do and just lose moral actor status, or just decide that you can't be a moral actor because you have a family. I don't know if that is the case, but that's sort of why you don't do it, so you don't have to make that choice. But Dickie Barrett might say that he's not a coward, he's just never been tested. He'd like to think that if he was, he would pass. But I don't know. I think sometimes staying out of trouble might be the best course of action. So yeah, you can sort of see how this darkens it up. It's sort of making it more brown than gray or black. And that's because the layers have been fairly uneven. Yeah. Cool. I've sort of wanted to talk about the difference between a public whose main source of entertainment is books and a public whose main source of entertainment is television or equivalent media. I mean, the big thing is that certain industries exist to support there is a television industry that exists in a certain place, and that sort of affects the viewpoints, I guess, expressed in that content, and it affects how those things are made. And books are more spread out in time, and also less geographically dependent. It's easier for one person to write a book, and so you sort of see more varied viewpoints. And there's always been sort of trashy genre fiction, but it's pretty easy these days to figure out what is or isn't trashy genre fiction, and it's actually going to be hard to find trashy genre fiction that's old, because those books don't usually survive. So yeah, reading books is really helpful for me to think about things from other people's perspectives, and to not think that people's opinions or viewpoints are bad because they're bad, or because it's sort of as reflective of anything else other than other people think in different ways. Other people have different personalities, and society exists as a collection of people, and so you can't, with one just coming from one background or one personality, just dismiss a whole group of people. Yeah, so I'm trying to be kind of sneaky here. So yeah, I read a lot, and I went through a brief period where I read less. So I was maybe only reading like eight books a year for a couple years, and that was really low, and it was mostly just like easy to read, sort of like safe stuff, I guess, like Stephen King. And I do like Stephen King, and I still read, I try to read a Stephen King book every year, because I know that if he dies in 10 years and I live another 300, at that rate, I will not have exhausted his output. I can't wait for the Stephen King Tupac books that come out 10, 20, 30 years after he's dead. That will be pretty appropriate. And I wonder if any of them will be really good. He also might never die. Don't take it for granted. Well, So yeah, I guess it sounds like I have a pretty low opinion of television, and I probably do as the industry and activity as a whole. I think people spend way too much time on it, but I think there are examples of mass media that help people think. I think like Cosmos by Carl Sagan, and you get your Fred Rogers, and you get your Bob Ross, and so there's all sorts of good and helpful television as well. And so I'm not trying to make the medium sound more monstrous. I'm just saying that reading is a different activity than watching a TV show or playing a video game, or listening to a book on tape, and it really helps you put yourself in another person's, I hate the shoes, into another person's perspective, and that seems like key in making fair and ethical decisions elsewhere in your life. This is pretty saturated, so I'm gonna mop some of this stuff up, slap it over here, and then I'm gonna dry this off. Cool beans. So I think it's time to darken this up as well with some blue. I need to mix up my blue. I'm not on the ball. It's Phthalo Blue. I'm not gonna mix it with anything else. People talk, so I think that this is probably true for heavier pigments. One of the reasons people like M. Graham is the honey binder makes it wet and re-wet better. Well, allegedly. I find with Phthalo Blue, I find with Winsor Newton and the pigments I use, which are more transparent with smaller particles, that it doesn't seem to be an issue to re-wet them. But with larger particles, I imagine it could be. I do find the M. Graham paints to be more watery. More watery. Yeah, that's right. Than Daniel Smith or Winsor Newton, but not by much, and I've enjoyed them so far. I got some Phthalo Blue. They labeled the Phthalo Blue green shade, which everyone uses, or people use more. They label that Phthalo Blue instead of having the green shade, red shade thing, which I find needlessly confusing. But a lot of companies get better at that over time, and naming their pigments things more close to, or basically just naming their colors after pigments instead of trying to call it like antique gold or based on an antiquated color like genuine rose madder, stuff like that. I don't think that's the way to go. I think it's confusing, and they're usually convenience mixtures that I think are made for older people, older artists that maybe used to use genuine rose madder. Yeah, and I think just generally the last thing I was going to finish up with was kind of the point of all of this is there's a lot of people that just it sort of started out with explicitly just people being mad about stuff and like feeding outrage. It's got a little more nuanced, but there's a lot of people that express their views on a regular basis on the internet, and I've noticed a big thing for me, I guess, in evaluating those people, and the biggest response that these people get sort of right away is there's often limits to people's credibility that they kind of display, or they wear their biases sort of proudly on their chest, or they like identify themselves in a group to try to get easier subscribers. And it's like I said I want to show that people have more varied political opinions, but I just sort of want to really honestly represent myself, and because I think like a big thing going forward, like with a lowered expectation of privacy that people either, I mean, a lot of people post themselves like on the internet and limit their own privacy. So I think that like integrity is important, and being able to explain yourself is important, and you don't want to actively invite people to harass you, but like just random internet people, because they're like, someone could see something and they could be unstable and they could, but you don't want to misrepresent your views, and you should be willing, like I in person am pretty much willing to talk about everything, and I like people talk to me about things that are difficult to talk about, and I remain consistent on that. And I think that it might just be like a character trait that I got that might be which sort of causes some trouble, because I see a lot of things as dishonest that other people might not, just because they're dressing up their responses too much, or just like really, really, really over concerned with people's feelings, especially children's feelings, and unwilling to be honest with them. It's just like when you're talking, especially to kids, you really should be as honest with them as possible. I mean, I think there's exceptions, but I mean, for instance, keeping up traditional lies for no reason other than to keep up traditional lies, like Santa Claus, or you're saying, well, you don't want the kid telling their friends there's no Santa Claus, because then you as a parent would get shit for it from the other parents, and it's like you should be willing to not want to lie to other people's children as well, and not, there's just no reason to keep that stuff going, and that is a really basic, I mean, some might say it doesn't really matter, but I think for some people, when they realize they're being lied to by their parents, that's like a pretty pivotal moment in their lives, and not always for the good. So yeah, don't lie to your kids. And I think the thing is, there's not very many people. There's a relatively small amount of people that are trying to influence opinion right now, and they all have really explicit motives. Some of them are getting paid to do it, some of them are doing it for ideological reasons, but oftentimes people that act really ideological don't have really well-defined ideologies. They've done little research to support their points, and they're in a particular, I don't know, self-righteous or like tribalistic mindset. So yeah, back to the beginning. Orwell has an article called On Nationalism, and he talks about what we call tribalism now, and he says right at the beginning that nationalism isn't the only thing he's talking about. And it's really good stuff. It's a short article, orwell.ru. All this stuff is available on orwell.ru, or you can just Google text for it. The stuff earlier about television, people used to read a lot. The literacy used to be wider. People technically read probably just as much because they read their smartphones, but it's just not the same. It takes more attention to read than watch television, and there's ways to track how people are paying attention, the dilation of their pupils and stuff like that, and this stuff has been studied. And so yeah, don't pick and evaluate different people's opinions as often as you can, and one of the best ways to do that is to read. Also, just reading books written decades ago is usually really pretty helpful. Really pretty helpful in providing a bit of context, and who can use a little more context. So I think I'm about finishing up. Going back to Finland. This is looking more developed, but, you know, One thing with this method is, especially when you're kind of trash at it, like I am, you sort of wonder where you stop because it all looks so mids. I'm gonna, like I said, this has all been in primary color, but I am probably gonna do a 2-color black pretty soon. If I have my stuff together, I will do that next video. Who knows when that will come out. Alright. Shalom. Is that true?